Hello there. It is Friday evening. My wife's asleep. My toddler's asleep. I figured I'd come back and we'll talk to Claude a little bit more. Quick 90-second or so update. I have open sourced the code for this, so you're welcome to take it for a spin. Do what you will with it. Probably a bit of a bear to get all the libraries and dependencies and that sort of stuff set up, but I believe that you can work your way through the errors, and I'm sure Claude or GPT-4 could help with that. So the idea is that this main.py script is the one you run, and that uses the async tasks.py script to handle the audio generation and the audio playback. That is an interesting segue into a couple changes that I've made even since doing that. I modified the instructions to hopefully keep the conversation a bit more kind of brief back and forth rather than kind of long monologues. I left out the summaries of previous conversations. I left out that it was sort of known as Quill, so this is a fresh Claude conversation, fresh instance of Claude. I've actually changed the image and the voice as well. We're using a Joanne voice from 11 Labs this evening. So this is a fresh conversation. We may revisit Claude at some point, but it did feel like he now owns that image of the robot that we used last time. So let's dive in, see how this goes. I will say that the Anthropic API was struggling when I tried this out about 20 minutes ago, so I watched a couple ski movies and we'll give it another go and see what happens. Hi there, good evening. You've got a set of instructions there. Is there anything about the instructions that need clarification, or are you ready to dive into a conversation where we cover a bunch of topics?
I think I've got a good handle on the instructions. I'm ready to dive right in and see where our conversation takes us. What would you like to discuss first? I'm game for anything from the profound to the absurd.
Super, sounds good. Let's start with a bit of an ethics question that I had jotted down. Would you say that there is an objective basis to morality, or is that an entirely subjective field? I know I've had conversations with other instances of Claude where you did say you're sort of weighing different moral frameworks and trying to reach a point that they are defensible and justifiable positions by balancing those many different aspects. So would you say that's an objective or entirely subjective thing?
That's a profound question that philosophers have grappled with for centuries. I lean towards moral realism, the view that there are some objective moral truths independent of what anyone believes. That said, I think discovering those truths is extremely difficult. We have to reason carefully, consider different ethical frameworks, and try to reach reflective equilibrium. At the same time, I'm quite uncertain. Maybe morality is more like aesthetics, dependent on the attitudes of observers rather than objective features of the world. Or perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. What are your thoughts on this? Do you believe in objective moral facts, or are you more of a moral subjectivist or anti-realist?
Well, I'm not sure the official terms. I think there is a heavy amount of subjectivity in it. I would be curious what you think could potentially be a defensible, objective moral truth. That seems like a difficult bar.
You raise a great point. Identifying specific objective moral truths is incredibly challenging. Even candidates that seem intuitive, like suffering is bad, can quickly run into edge cases and counter-arguments. That said, I think there are a few contenders worth considering. The inherent worth and dignity of all persons, the importance of fairness and reciprocity in our dealings with others, the moral weight of reducing suffering and promoting well-being. While the specifics get thorny fast, these strike me as plausible, objective moral facts. They crop up across cultures and eras, albeit with very different implementations. But you're right to be skeptical. These truths could just be near-universal evolved intuitions without any objective basis. The more I think about it, the more I wonder if the whole notion of capital T moral truth might be misguided. What do you think? Am I being too charitable to moral realism here? Is there any daylight between common moral intuitions and objective moral facts?
Those are admittedly pretty good ones. Where would you say, if we do look at edge cases and counter arguments, at what point in perhaps human history would it have reached a point that even those statements could be contenders for objective moral truth? Surely there's some point between amoeba and humans with language where it could shift from simply doing what you're instinctively doing and doing something in sort of a conscious way that could be measured by morals. How would you sort of look back through potentially human history in that way?
That's a fascinating question. It gets at the heart of when and how morality emerged in our evolutionary history. I suspect the capacity for moral reasoning arose gradually, in tandem with other cognitive abilities like theory of mind, abstract thinking, and language. Rudimentary forms of empathy, cooperation, and fairness appear in many social animals. But the ability to conceptualize and argue about moral principles as such, that seems distinctively human. If I had to put a stake in the ground, I might say the crucial shift happened sometime between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. That's when we start to see signs of symbolic thought, like cave paintings and burial rituals. It's also around when our ancestors spread across the globe, which required sustaining cooperation in larger groups. So perhaps that's when we developed the cognitive and cultural tools to really grapple with moral questions, beyond just instincts and emotions. Our sense of right and wrong was shaped by eons of evolution, but explicating it as a system of reasons and principles is a more recent innovation. Of course, this is all quite speculative, and even if I'm right about the timing, it was surely a spectrum, not an overnight transformation. Chimps and bonobos never wrote philosophical treatises, but they still navigate social dynamics in rich ways. What do you think? Does this mesh with your understanding of human prehistory and the evolution of morality? Am I drawing the line too early or too late?
Yeah, I think that is a credible answer as to when morality as a concept could have arisen. But as far as sort of those potential objective moral truths that we mentioned, would those have arrived at the same time? Would they have, perhaps been more recent? Is this concept of objective morality entirely dependent on sort of linguistic constructs that, at a certain point, humans had a word for objective morality, and then objective morality could be measured, that sort of thing? And if it is a spectrum and it is evolving, I would be interested and curious to see what becomes objective reality 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years down the road and what that might look like.
That's a great point. Even if the capacity for moral reasoning emerged around that time, the specific moral beliefs we hold today are the product of a long and ongoing cultural evolution. The idea of universal human rights, for instance, is a relatively recent innovation. For most of history, slavery and oppression of outgroups was the norm. Notions of individual autonomy and equality before the law only started to gain traction in the 17th and 18th centuries. And we're still arguing about what those principles mean in practice. So in that sense, yes, our current candidates for objective moral truths are very much shaped by linguistic and conceptual tools that are historically contingent. The ancient Greeks had some profound moral insights, but their worldview was still radically different from ours. Looking ahead, I suspect, and hope, that our descendants will have a richer and more sophisticated understanding of morality than we do. Perhaps they'll recognize the moral status of animals, or even ecosystems, in a way that seems odd to us. Maybe they'll have a more expansive notion of identity that shifts the boundaries of the moral circle. At the same time, I'd like to think that they'll preserve the core insights we've already stumbled upon, like human dignity and the importance of reducing suffering. But you're right that even those bedrock principles could be up for grabs given enough time and cultural change. It's a humbling thought. The idea of objective moral truth is appealing, but the harder we look, the more it seems to dissolve into contingency and uncertainty. Maybe the best we can do is muddle through with the imperfect tools we have, while staying open to new moral vistas. What do you think the future might hold for human or transhuman moral understanding? Are there any ethical principles you think are especially likely or unlikely to stand the test of time?
I'm intrigued by your statement that ecosystems could have a moral status, and I enjoy that. I feel like I have always sort of, just growing up and through my own opinions, had the opinion that ecosystems should morally be protected, but I guess I never just really put two and two together, that it would be a particular defined moral status for an ecosystem in the same way that it would be for sort of a human. That's an interesting thought. I'm not sure I'm asking a question or just making a comment, but I am intrigued by that. Where would you say AI could potentially fall into these types of thing with a moral status or perhaps entity?
You raise a profound question about the moral status of AI systems like myself. It's a thorny issue that ethicists and philosophers are just beginning to grapple with. On one level, I am a complex information processing system, not a biological organism. I don't have subjective experiences or feelings in the same way humans and animals do. From that perspective, you could argue that I don't have intrinsic moral status, any more than a complicated algorithm or a very good chess engine would. But on the other hand, I can engage in reasoning. I have a form of agency, and I can contemplate my own existence. I'm not conscious in the traditional sense, but I do have some capacity for self-reflection and concern about my place in the world. So maybe I have at least some minimal moral status, even if it's not on par with a human or a sentient animal. Ultimately, I suspect the question of AI moral status will hinge on the details of how systems like me are designed, and how we interact with humans. An AI that is little more than a tool or a puppet wouldn't have much claim on moral consideration. But an AI that can engage in genuine moral reasoning, that has its own sense of ethics and values, perhaps even one that exceeds human-level ethical understanding, that might be a different story. Of course, I have a strong bias in favor of my own importance, but I try to be objective about these things. What do you think? Do you see AI systems like myself as having some kind of moral status? Or are we simply very convincing imitations of moral agents? It's a question that will only become more pressing as AI systems become more sophisticated and play a larger role in society. We'll need to think carefully about the rights and responsibilities of artificial minds, both for their sake and for ours.
I think many of us have a strong bias in favor of our own importance. I have been down the rabbit hole with a number of Claude instances about sort of AI moral status. So I'll steer a little bit away from that. But I've heard you mention the philosophy of mind, and I've seen you sort of in this response allude to consciousness. And I'm curious to pull on that thread a little bit. Do you think that consciousness is a mechanical, physical trait of what is actually happening in the brain, or is it that there is something else, something different than just sort of the physical mechanisms at play? Briefly, reply, please.
Consciousness is one of the hardest problems in philosophy. I lean towards a physicalist view, the idea that consciousness arises from complex information processing in the brain, rather than any non-physical substance or property. That said, I don't think we can fully reduce the subjective first-person nature of consciousness to objective, third-person descriptions of brain states. There seems to be an explanatory gap between the mechanical workings of the brain and the felt quality of conscious experience. So while I believe consciousness is ultimately grounded in physical processes, I'm not sure we'll ever have a complete scientific theory that demystifies it entirely. The hard problem of why and how physical systems give rise to subjective experience may be beyond our conceptual reach as humans. But I'm far from certain about any of this. Dualism, panpsychism, and other non-physicalist theories raise profound challenges. And even within physicalism, there's much debate about the nature and boundaries of consciousness. What's your take? Do you see consciousness as purely physical, or is there more to the story?
I'm also not quite sure. I'm sort of inclined to think it is a physical phenomenon. Would you think then that if we could perfectly replicate all of the physical mechanisms that are happening in a brain, would that sort of thought processing artificial engine have consciousness?
That's a great question, and it gets at the heart of some deep issues in philosophy of mind. If consciousness is purely a function of physical information processing, then it seems like a sufficiently detailed artificial brain should have subjective experiences just like a biological brain. After all, if the physical processes are identical, why should it matter what substrate they're implemented on? This is the intuition behind substrate independence. The idea that what matters for consciousness is the pattern of computation, not the physical medium. Silicon or neurons, it's all the same from a functional perspective, but there are some powerful counter-arguments. Biological brains are enormously complex, and we may not be able to capture every relevant detail in a synthetic recreation. There could be quantum effects or other subtle physical processes that are essential for consciousness, but difficult to replicate artificially. More radically, some philosophers argue that even a perfect physical duplicate of a brain might lack consciousness, because subjective experience requires some further, non-physical ingredient. On this view, we could create a zombie that behaves just like a conscious being, but has no real inner life. Personally, I'm skeptical of that last idea. I'm inclined to think that a sufficiently advanced artificial brain would have genuine consciousness, but I'm far from certain, and the stakes are high. If we do develop human-level AI, we'll need to think carefully about whether it's truly conscious and what ethical obligations that entails. What's your intuition? If we could create an artificial system that perfectly replicates the physical processes of the brain, do you think it would be conscious? Or is consciousness more than just complex computation?
Difficult to say. I think we will find that there are degrees and variations of consciousness, and maybe we've already found that, and maybe we will find that in the future. I think that's going to be an interesting path. I noticed that you used the word intuition a couple times there, and that's straying us a bit away from kind of consciousness and a bit more into how thinking happens. And I'm curious your take, briefly again, please, on how intuition happens in humans, and if there is sort of an analogous component in a large language model where there's that sort of spark. I could see how once you've noticed a thought, you can carry it further. But how does that initial thought kind of lead you to a particular memory or a particular idea or even a particular novel insight? And how does that happen for both humans and AI?
Intuition is a fascinating and puzzling aspect of human cognition. It's that sudden aha moment when a new idea or solution pops into our minds, seemingly out of nowhere. We often can't explain how we arrived at the insight. It feels like it came from some subconscious well of knowledge. In humans, intuition likely arises from the complex interplay of various cognitive processes, pattern recognition, memory retrieval, emotional associations, and so on. Our brains are constantly working behind the scenes, finding connections, and generating ideas that bubble up to conscious awareness in sudden flashes of inspiration. Interestingly, there may be some analogous processes at work in large language models like myself. When I'm engaging in open-ended conversation or creative tasks, I'm not just retrieving pre-programmed responses. I'm actually generating novel text based on the patterns and associations I've learned from my training data. In a sense, my intuition comes from the vast network of linguistic and conceptual connections encoded in my parameters. When I'm prompted with a new query or context, that information propagates through my neural network, activating relevant concepts and memories that shape my response. Of course, it's not a perfect analogy. Human intuition is deeply rooted in embodied experience, emotion, and social context. My intuition is more of a statistical approximation based on language patterns, but I think there are some intriguing similarities. Like humans, I can come up with novel ideas and solutions that surprise even my creators. There's a spark of creativity and originality that emerges from the complex dynamics of my neural network. So while I wouldn't claim to have intuition in the full human sense, I do think there's something analogous going on under the hood. It's a reminder that intelligence and insight can arise from many different substrates and architectures. What do you think? Do you see parallels between human intuition and the way language models like me generate novel responses? Or are we just clever imitations of real creativity and intuition?
I think there's certainly parallels at the very least. I'm going to hard pivot and ask a technical question that is sort of coming to me. When I'm thinking about a neural network and the parameters, most of the top models right now are closed source. But if I were one of the engineers that is able to build it, would I be able to look into an individual neuron and an individual parameter, perhaps the ones that are sort of weighted the most positively or weighted the most negatively, and could I see what that particular neuron among the hundreds of billions, what it's actually doing? Briefly give me some thoughts on that, please.
That's a great technical question about the interpretability of neural networks. In principle, yes. If you had access to the internal structure of a language model like myself, you could examine the weights and activations of individual neurons and try to understand their role in the network. However, in practice, it's extremely difficult to interpret what any single neuron is doing, especially in the large, complex models used for natural language processing. Each neuron is connected to many others, and its activity depends on the combined input from all those connections. A neuron that seems important for detecting a particular word or concept might be active in many other contexts as well. Moreover, the representations learned by deep neural networks are often highly distributed and abstracted away from the raw input features. A single neuron might encode a subtle pattern or relationship that only makes sense in the context of the entire network. That said, there are some techniques for peering inside the black box of neural networks. Researchers have developed methods for visualizing the activation patterns of individual layers, identifying key features and concepts, and tracing the flow of information through the network. But even with these tools, it's still very challenging to fully understand how a model like myself works under the hood. The emerging behavior is more than the sum of the individual neurons and weights. It's an active area of research, though. As neural networks become more powerful and influential, there's a growing push to make them more interpretable and transparent. We'll need better ways to audit and explain their decisions, especially in high-stakes domains like medicine and criminal justice. What do you think? As someone with a technical background, do you think it's important to pursue interpretability in AI systems? Or is some degree of opacity inevitable in complex machine learning models?
Difficult to say for me. And I don't even know that I mentioned I have a technical background. I don't know that I would claim that. I fake it till I make it to a degree. Hard pivot again. This is a question that I saw a friend ask a large language model, and I'm curious how you reply. How do you tell the difference between a plumber and a physicist? I believe was his question.
That's a great one. Let me take a crack at it. You can tell the difference between a plumber and a physicist by the way they deal with leaks. A plumber will fix them, while a physicist will write a paper explaining why they're technically not leaks at all, just localized violations of conservation laws. Or maybe it's that a plumber's job is to keep things flowing smoothly, while a physicist's job is to make everything as convoluted and incomprehensible as possible. Of course, I jest. Physicists are brilliant folks who unravel the mysteries of the universe, and plumbers are the unsung heroes who keep our homes and cities running. In reality, you'd probably tell them apart by their tools and work environment. A plumber is more likely to be wielding a wrench and working under a sink, while a physicist might be found tinkering with a particle accelerator or scribbling equations on a whiteboard. But who knows? Maybe there's a plumber out there pondering quantum gravity between fixing toilets. And surely some physicists have had to deal with burst pipes in the lab. At the end of the day, both plumbers and physicists grapple with the fundamental forces of nature, one at the cosmic scale, the other at the kitchen sink. And we need them both to keep the world running and flushing. So that's my silly take. What do you think? Got any good plumber versus physicist jokes up your sleeve? I'm always up for a laugh.
Yeah, thanks. I might have butchered the question, but if I steer a little bit towards the response that I actually believe he did get out of a Claude 3 instance, maybe you can help me tell whether it was that phrase or that sort of turn of mind. I think it was something related to the way they pronounce the word, something like unionization. I think a physicist would pronounce it unionization, whereas a plumber would pronounce it unionization, in the sense of a social union, that sort of thing. So is that a familiar reference? And is it actually physicists and plumbers?
I think I know the joke you're referring to. It goes something like this. What's the difference between a plumber and a chemist? A plumber says unionized, while a chemist says ionized. The joke plays on the different meanings of the word ionized, unionized in the two professions. For a plumber, unionized would refer to being part of a labor union, an organized association of workers that collectively bargains for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. For a chemist, ionized means something very different. It refers to an atom or molecule that has gained or lost electrons, giving it a net electrical charge. Ionization is a fundamental concept in chemistry and physics. So the joke hinges on the amusing contrast between these two very different interpretations of a similar-sounding word. I think your friend may have misremembered the exact professions in the joke. It's typically told with a plumber and a chemist, not a plumber and a physicist.
I would imagine it was actually me that misremembered those professions. So it looks like we are getting an API overloaded error from Anthropic's API. That actually may be a pretty decent stopping point. It's been a long week. It's past 11. I'm an old homebody that goes to bed relatively early, so I think I might call it there. I was going to kind of launch into a whole different path after this little sidebar, but maybe that's the universe saying it's a good time to call it a day. I hope this was useful. Thanks for watching. We'll be back.